72-year-old Alma Jessup sat at the head of the polished mahogany dining table in her daughter's upscale Pittsburgh home, the steam still rising from the homemade apple pie she had spent 4 hours perfecting that morning. It was Easter Sunday, a day meant for resurrection and family, but as the silver fork in her hand began to tremble, Alma realized this was actually a funeral for her autonomy. Without a word of warning between the ham and the side dishes, her daughter Candace had slid a glossy, clinical-smelling brochure across the lace tablecloth, the words Oakview County Asylum staring back at Alma like a death warrant. Across the table, her son Paul did not even look up from his plate, his jaw working rhythmically as he chewed a thick slice of honey-glazed meat, while her son-in-law Drew took a slow, deliberate sip of an expensive Cabernet. The air in the room suddenly felt vacuum-sealed, smelling of cinnamon, expensive perfume, and the sharp, metallic tang of betrayal that Alma recognized from 3 decades working the night shift in the emergency room. Candace leaned forward, her eyes as cold as the marble countertops in her designer kitchen, and told her 72-year-old mother that it was time to be realistic because she had become a liability that nobody had the time to manage anymore. She spoke to Alma with the slow, condescending enunciations one might use for a toddler or a broken appliance, explaining that they had already contacted her landlord to end her lease by the end of the month. Drew chimed in with a practiced corporate smirk, noting that her nursing skills were decades out of date and that the county home was efficient enough for someone of her limited capacity. Even as the ringing in her ears grew into a deafening roar, Alma felt a familiar, icy clarity wash over her, the same surgical focus that had allowed her to restart a stopped heart while a dozen people screamed in panic. She looked at Paul, the son who still owed her $34,000 from a failed investment she had covered with her retirement savings, but he merely reached for the gravy boat, his silence confirming that her lifetime of sacrifice had been appraised and found worthless. What her children did not realize as they watched the elderly woman quietly stand up was that they were not witnessing a surrender, but the first moment of a calculated mobilization. They saw a spent, fragile woman who had outlived her utility, but Alma was already mentally inventorying her vintage leather nursing bag and the $4,000 in emergency cash she had hidden in a flower jar back at her apartment. As she walked to the sink to wash her dessert plate with the methodical precision of someone preparing for a sterile field, she made a silent vow that she would rather sleep in the dirt than spend a single night in the cage they had picked out for her. The brochure on the table was meant to be the end of her story, but what none of them knew was that the following morning, Alma would stand in a dusty county courthouse and bid $5 on a rotting, ivy-choked ruin that the rest of the world had discarded. They thought they were decommissioning a legacy system, but they were actually triggering the most dangerous emergency of their lives, because a woman with nothing left to lose is the only one who can truly rebuild. If you have ever felt like your own children were looking at you like a piece of old furniture to be moved out of the way, or if you have spent your entire life saving everyone else only to realize that no one is coming to save you, then you understand the fire starting to burn in Alma's chest. You are about to witness the moment the people who underestimated this 72-year-old nurse realize they have not just lost a mother, they have lost their only connection to a grace they never deserved. Subscribe to this channel now, because every woman deserves to see the look on a greedy child's face when they realize the person they tried to discard has become more powerful than they ever imagined. Stay with us until the end to see how $5 and a stubborn heart can turn a pile of broken bricks into a sanctuary that will bring a whole valley back to life while leaving those who betrayed her in the dust of their own arrogance. A nurse never truly retires, she just waits for the right emergency to show the world who she really is. The story of Alma's long walk toward that Pittsburgh dining table did not begin with a brochure, but with a blackout in the summer of 1974. She was a 20-year-old student nurse at Wheeling General, her uniform crisp and her heart full of a clinical sort of ambition, when a localized storm knocked out the hospital's secondary generators. In the flickering emergency lights, she met Vernon Jessup, a charismatic electrician with grease under his fingernails and a smile that promised a world where nothing stayed broken for long. He had fixed the lights that night, and Alma, watching his capable hands move with such certainty, felt a sudden, dangerous sense of safety that she would spend the next 5 decades trying to maintain. They were married within the year, a modest ceremony where she wore a dress she had sewn herself, and for a while the hum of their new life felt like the steady rhythm of a healthy heart. She believed she had found a partner who would build a foundation as solid as the limestone hills of West Virginia, never suspecting that she was the one who would become the mortar holding every brick in place. By their 5th anniversary, the first cracks in the foundation began to show, not as a sudden collapse, but as a series of quiet, expensive whispers. Alma had saved every penny from her first years on the floor, nearly $4,000 intended to buy her way into a small medical partnership that would have fulfilled her dream of a rural clinic. But Vernon had a business opportunity, a venture involving heavy machinery and a handshake that required exactly what she had tucked away in her high-yield savings account. He promised it was an investment in their future, a way to ensure she would never have to work a double shift again, and Alma, driven by a deep-seated need for harmony and a lingering trust in his mechanical hands, handed over the check. That was the first time she put her own name in a drawer to make room for his, watching her dream of an independent clinic fade into the background as she focused on keeping their domestic lights burning. She told herself that a wife was a builder of homes, not just a healer of bodies, and she leaned harder into her shifts at the hospital to cover the shortfall that his failed venture left behind. As the 80s bled into the 90s, Alma's life became a masterclass in the art of the invisible engine, a woman who provided all the fuel while the world only saw the car moving. She rose to become the head ER nurse at Wheeling General, a position of immense authority, where surgeons deferred to her judgment and lives were saved by her split-second decisions during the graveyard shift. Yet, the moment she stepped through her own front door, that authority was expected to vanish like steam from a kettle, replaced by the quiet efficiency of a woman who never let a shirt go unpressed or a meal go uncooked. She would come home after 12 hours of managing cardiac arrests and gunshot wounds, only to find Vernon waiting for his 3-course dinner, his moods dictated by the performance of the local racetrack. She learned to read the tension in his shoulders, like a patient's vital signs, adjusting her own volume and presence to keep the peace, becoming a ghost in her own hallways. She ironed his work shirts with surgical precision, the smell of starch and hot metal becoming the scent of her own submission, a sacrifice she framed as loyalty for the sake of the children. The children, Candace and Paul, were the primary beneficiaries of Alma's relentless erosion, though they were raised to believe their comfort was a natural law of the universe. When Candace wanted to attend an elite private school in Pittsburgh to start her journey toward becoming a bank manager, Alma took on extra weekend shifts until her feet were perpetually swollen and her back throbbed with a dull, constant ache. She made sure Candace had the designer clothes and the expensive tutors, shielding her daughter from the reality of their mounting debts and the hidden bank notices that Vernon was increasingly adept at concealing. Alma wanted her daughter to be powerful, but in her zeal to provide, she forgot to teach her the value of the hands that did the providing. Candace grew up watching her mother serve, categorizing Alma's labor as an expected utility rather than a gift of love. By the time Candace was 20, she looked at her mother's weathered hands and silvering hair not with gratitude, but with a budding clinical sort of disdain, seeing only a woman who had allowed herself to be used, never realizing she was the one doing the using. Paul was a different kind of burden, a weak-willed reflection of his father's worst impulses that Alma tried to heal with a bottomless well of maternal forgiveness. When he came to her at age 35 with a desperate plan for a consultancy firm that existed only on paper, Alma didn't hesitate to empty her remaining retirement cushions to hand him $34,000. She ignored the warning signs she would have spotted in a heartbeat on a triage floor, the shifting eyes, the grandiosely vague promises, the smell of desperation masked by expensive cologne. She wanted to believe that her son could be the man Vernon had failed to be, and she paid for that belief with the last of her financial autonomy. She told herself it was a loan, a temporary bridge to his success, but deep down, she knew it was a ransom payment for a love he only offered when his bank account was empty. Paul took the money with a mumbled thanks and a reach for the gravy boat. Never once considering that every dollar represented a year of his mother's life, she would never get back. During those long decades, Vernon's gambling habits moved from a hobby to a parasitic infection that drained the family's marrow, while Alma worked double shifts to keep the lights on. She would find betting slips tucked into his pockets while she did the laundry, the smell of cheap cigars and stale beer clinging to his clothes like a second skin. When he suggested they refinance the house for the third time, claiming it was for a new electrical contract that would finally set them up for life, she signed the papers in a haze of exhaustion and misplaced hope. She chose to believe his luck would turn because the alternative, admitting she was tethered to a sinking ship, was too terrifying to contemplate at 55. She became an expert at the triage of poverty, deciding which bills could wait and which repairs were essential, while Vernon continued to play the role of the big spender at the local tavern. She was the head nurse of a household in permanent cardiac arrest, her own dreams of that rural clinic, now a dusty memory buried under layers of his broken promises and the children's endless demands. There were signs of something else during those middle years, sementes of a mystery that Alma was too tired to investigate at the time, details that would only gain weight decades later. Vernon would disappear for days at a time, claiming he was doing contract work down in Marshall County, specifically near a place he called the Liberty District. He would return with mud on his boots and a strange, haunted look in his eyes, smelling not of beer or smoke but of damp earth and old limestone. Once, she found a rusted iron key in his jewelry box that didn't fit any lock in their house, and when she asked him about it, he snapped at her with a ferocity that was entirely uncharacteristic of his usual jovial negligence. He told her it was a bad investment he was trying to liquidate, a liability that wasn't worth the dirt it sat on, and Alma, already managing the crises of 2 teenagers and a full hospital ward, let the matter drop. She didn't have the energy to chase his ghosts when the living were already screaming for her attention, so she let the secret of Marshall County stay buried in the soot of their hearth. Then came the final 4 years, the period that truly broke Alma's body, while refining her spirit into something as sharp and cold as a scalpel. Vernon's health collapsed with the same suddenness of a blown fuse, his heart finally giving out after years of stress and self-neglect. Because the children claimed they were too busy with their careers and their own families, the entire burden of his end-of-life care fell squarely on Alma's 70-year-old shoulders. She became his primary nurse, his housekeeper, and his debt collector all at once, spending every waking hour cleaning up his physical and financial messes. She spent those years in a blur of antiseptic and wood smoke, lifting his heavy frame, changing his linens, and watching his eyes go dim as he whispered apologies for things he had no power to fix anymore. When he finally took his last breath, he left her with a house that was legally a shell and a mountain of medical bills that swallowed the last of his life insurance within a month. She was 72 years old, alone in a quiet house, and for the first time in 52 years, she had no one to serve, yet she felt more tired than she ever had after a 30-hour shift. In the months following the funeral, the erosion of Alma's identity became an intentional project led by Candace, who began to speak about her mother in the past tense, even when Alma was in the room. Candace would visit with a tape measure and a critical eye, commenting on how the house was too large, how the stairs were a hazard, and how Alma's memory seemed to be slipping whenever Alma disagreed with her. It was a subtle, psychological campaign designed to make Alma feel like a liability, a piece of equipment that was no longer cost-effective to maintain. Candace used her position as a bank manager to audit Alma's meager accounts, tutting at the $34,000 hole Paul had left, using Alma's own generosity as proof of her incompetence. Alma listened to these lectures with a stoic silence, her silver hair kept in a tight, practical bun, her capable hands folded in her lap like sleeping birds. She saw what was happening, the triage of an elderly woman, but she was too depleted by grief and labor to fight back until the Easter Sunday meal turned into an execution. Her son Paul was the silent accomplice in this erasure, his weakness serving as the perfect foil for Candace's ambition. He would sit through these visits, staring at his phone or picking at his cuticles, only speaking when he needed to ask if he could have Vernon's old gold watch before it got lost in the movie. He never offered to help with the yard or the repairs, and he certainly never mentioned the $34,000 that could have kept Alma in her home for another decade. To Paul, His mother was a source of capital that had finally run dry, and therefore she was a complication he no longer wanted to manage. He agreed with everything Candace said because it absolved him of his own debts and his own guilt, allowing him to walk away from his mother's life with a clean conscience and a full stomach. Alma watched him, her own son, and saw the man she had enabled, realizing that her love had been a shield that had eventually become his sword against her. The son-in-law Drew provided the clinical justification for Alma's decommissioning, his corporate lawyer tongue turning Alma's decades of service into a list of outdated skills. During their visits, he would talk over her, discussing her as if she were a legacy system that needed to be replaced by something more efficient and modern. He spoke of the county home not as a place of exile, but as an optimization of her limited capacity, his smugness a layer of grease over the entire conversation. He was the one who scouted the facility, focusing on the security and the billing cycles rather than the quality of the light or the kindness of the staff. To Drew, Alma was an obstacle to his wife's focus, a domestic variable that needed to be solved so they could continue their social climbing without the tether of an aging mother. He looked at her sturdy work boots and her denim shirts with a refined disgust, seeing a woman of the earth who had no place in his world of glass and steel. By the time that Easter Sunday arrived, Alma had been thoroughly prepared for her own disappearance, a woman who had spent 52 years building everyone else's lives until she had no ground left to stand on. She had been a wife who carried her husband's debts, a mother who funded her children's dreams with her own blood and bone, and a nurse who saved strangers while her own soul went untended. She saw herself as the indispensable glue of the family, the one whose worth was proven by her utility, and it was only at that dining table looking at the brochure for Oakview County that she realized the glue was being scraped away to make the furniture look new again. The humiliation was not just in the brochure, but in the collective realization that she had raised 3 people who didn't see her as a person at all, but as an obligation to be managed. Her inner phrase, the one that had kept her moving through the night shifts and the gambling debts, finally failed her. She had stopped moving, and they had indeed realized she was invisible. The final layer of the betrayal was the landlord, who had been Alma's neighbor for 20 years and a friend of Vernon's, yet had already agreed to terminate her lease at Candace's request. He had called her just 2 days before Easter, his voice full of a forced, awkward sympathy, saying he was sorry it had to end this way, but that he agreed with the children that it was for the best. Alma had stood in her kitchen, the smell of the apple pie she was prepping for Sunday filling the air, and felt the walls of her world shrinking to the size of a coffin. She realized then that there was no one left in her corner, no ally in the city, no one who saw the head ER nurse beneath the silver bun and the weathered skin. She was 72, her bank account was a wasteland, her children were her executioners, and her home was a temporary staging ground for her own removal. She was a woman who had spent a lifetime in the emergency room, yet she was currently facing the only trauma she didn't know how to treat, her own obsolescence. As she stood up from that table in Pittsburgh, the silver fork still ringing against the mahogany, Alma felt the familiar icy clarity of the ER floor settle over her, like a shroud. She looked at Candace, Paul, and Drew, and for the first time in 52 years, she didn't see her family. She saw a chaotic scene that needed to be stabilized and cleared. They thought they were sending a fragile old woman to a cage, but they were actually releasing a force of nature that had been compressed by 50 years of sacrifice. She thought of the rusted key in the jewelry box, the mud on Vernon's boots, and the $5 she had tucked into her pocket for the auction she had seen in the Gazette. The 52 years of silent dedication were over, and the woman who had spent her life saving everyone else was finally decisively going to save herself. The children didn't know it yet, but they had just triggered the one emergency they couldn't control, and the nurse was about to go back on the clock for the most important shift of her life. The air in Candace's dining room didn't just feel cold, it felt chemically stripped of oxygen, as if the expensive air purification system was working specifically to suffocate Alma Jessup. Across the table, her son-in-law Drew took a long, arrogant sip of a vintage Cabernet that probably cost more than Alma's weekly groceries, his eyes never leaving his phone as he scrolled through legal briefs. Beside him, Paul, The son who had drained $34,000 of her life savings for a dream that had only existed in his own lazy imagination was focused entirely on a thick slab of honey-glazed ham. There was a rhythmic, wet sound to his chewing that seemed to mock the silence, a sound that told Alma her presence was merely a background noise to his appetite. He didn't look at her when he reached for the gravy boat, his hand steady and his conscience apparently spotless, even as the brochure for the county asylum sat between them like a physical wall. The humiliation wasn't just in the proposal itself, but in the casual, mundane indifference with which they were dismantling a woman who had spent 52 years ensuring they never had to feel a moment's discomfort. Alma tried to speak, her voice a fragile rasp that she barely recognized as her own, asking Paul if he remembered the $34,000 he had taken from her 3 years ago. She reminded him that it was the money she had saved while working double shifts in the trauma unit, the money meant to keep her in her home when her joints finally gave out. Paul didn't even pause his chewing, his eyes fixed on a dollop of mashed potatoes as if they held the secrets of the universe. He simply waited for the silence to stretch into an uncomfortable, jagged thing before speaking to his sister instead of his mother. He mumbled that Candace was right and that it really was for the best that they consolidate things now before she lost track of her finances entirely. He didn't offer a timeline for repayment. He didn't offer a single word of gratitude for the sacrifice that had saved his credit score. To Paul, his mother wasn't a creditor or a benefactor. She was a bank that had finally closed its doors, and he was simply waiting for the final liquidation of her dignity. Candace didn't let the silence settle, her bank manager's instincts kicking in to close the deal before the emotion could complicate the paperwork. She informed Alma that she had already spoken to Mr. Henderson, the landlord who had lived next door to Alma for 20 years and shared 1,000 morning coffees with her husband. With a clinical precision that made Alma's blood run cold, Candace explained that the lease termination papers were already signed and the security deposit had been diverted to cover the first month's fees at Oakview County. There was no discussion, no request for Alma's input, and certainly no consideration for the memories attached to those 4 walls. Candace spoke of Alma's home as if it were a high-interest debt that needed to be settled, a liability that was dragging down the family's collective efficiency. She had dismantled Alma's life with a few phone calls and a professional smile, treating her mother's 20-year residency like a clerical error that had finally been corrected in the ledger, while the ham grew cold on the fine china plates. Drew leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking as he adjusted his posture to deliver the final professional verdict on Alma's utility. He looked at her sturdy, weathered hands and the faded denim of her shirt with the detached interest of an auditor examining a piece of depreciated machinery. He told Alma that her nursing skills were a legacy system and that the medical field had moved on to a point where she was more of a danger than an asset. He spoke of her 31 years as a head ER nurse, years of stopping hemorrhages and restarting hearts in the dead of night, as if they were nothing more than an outdated software version that was no longer compatible with the current market. He was telling her that her life's work was junk, that her knowledge was a burden, and that she should be grateful they found a facility efficient enough to manage her decline without bothering the rest of them. The sheer arrogance of his tone felt like a physical weight, pressing against Alma's chest until she could hear the rhythmic thumping of her own heart echoing in the hollow space of the dining room. The stacking of cruelties continued as Candace slid a printed checklist across the table, a document that detailed exactly which of Alma's belongings would be kept and which would be sold to fund the transition. She had decided, without consulting her mother, that the antique quilt Alma's grandmother had made was too dusty for the new facility, and that the heavy oak desk where Alma had kept the family books for decades was a fire hazard. Every item on the list represented a piece of Alma's history, a fragment of the identity she had built while serving them, and now those fragments were being appraised for their scrap value. Candace spoke about the liquidation process with the same tone she used for a failing branch of her bank, her eyes focused on the efficiency of the move rather than the destruction of a soul. She was erasing Alma's past to simplify her own future, treating her mother like a warehouse that needed to be cleared out before the end of the fiscal year. The list was a map of Alma's dispossession, a cold inventory of everything she was no longer allowed to own or cherish. Alma felt the familiar, icy clarity of the ER floor settle over her, a biological response to extreme trauma that turned her shaking hands into steady, clinical instruments. She watched her silver fork reflect the overhead chandelier, noticing the way the light fractured against the polished mahogany, while a high-pitched ringing in her ears drowned out the sound of Candace's voice. Her vision tunneled until the only thing she could see was the Oakview County brochure, the glossy images of smiling elderly people in sterile hallways looking back at her like a vision of purgatory. She realized in that moment that she wasn't just losing her home. She was being systematically deleted from the family narrative by the very people she had written into existence. The betrayal was so complete, so multi-layered, that it bypassed anger and went straight to a cold, surgical calculation of survival. She was 72 years old. She had $4,000 hidden in a flower jar, and she was currently sitting in a room full of people who saw her as a broken tool to be discarded in a convenient bin. As they began to discuss the logistics of the move-in date, Paul finally looked up from his plate, but it wasn't to offer comfort or to defend his mother's right to choose her own path. He leaned forward, his eyes darting toward the jewelry box Alma always kept in her purse, and asked if he could have his father's old gold watch before she was admitted to the home. He claimed he wanted to keep it safe so it wouldn't get lost in the shuffle of the move, but Alma saw the greed behind the thin veil of concern, a reflection of the man she had allowed him to become. He was already scavenging the remains of her life while she was still breathing at the head of the table, treating her like a corpse that hadn't quite realized it was dead yet. Candace nodded in agreement, noting that it would be one less item to inventory during the final packing process. The indifference was the sharpest knife of all, a collective agreement that Alma's feelings were irrelevant to the task of her removal, as if she were a ghost, haunting a house they were already preparing to flip for a profit. The final blow came from Candace, who leaned in close, her perfume smelling of expensive lilies and cold ambition, and told Alma not to make a scene, because it would only make things harder for everyone. She looked her mother in the eye and said that Alma was 72, that she had nothing left to offer the world, and that the only value she had left was the work she could still do for the family by going quietly into the facility. Those words hung in the air like a death sentence, a formal declaration that Alma's worth was now zero in the eyes of the people she had sacrificed her entire life to protect. She was being told that her existence was a burden, and that her history was a liability, and that her only remaining duty was to disappear without causing an inconvenience to their schedules. The cruelty wasn't just in the words, but in the absolute certainty with which Candace delivered them, as if she were stating a universal law that Alma was too old or too slow to understand. It was the ultimate demolition of her spirit, a total erasure of the woman who had once been the head ER nurse. Without a word, Alma pushed her chair back, the wooden legs letting out a sharp, protesting screech against the hardwood floor that made Drew flinch. She picked up her dessert plate, the slice of apple pie she hadn't touched sitting like a heavy, golden weight on the porcelain, and walked toward the kitchen with a gait that was steady and purposeful. She stood at the sink, the hot water steaming against her skin, and began to wash the plate with the methodical, surgical precision of someone preparing a sterile field for a high-stakes operation. She scrubbed every inch of the porcelain, dried it with a clean linen towel, and placed it back in the cabinet with a quiet click that sounded like a door locking forever. She didn't look at the three people sitting in the dining room, she didn't scream, and she didn't beg for a mercy they were incapable of giving. She simply finished the task, picked up her vintage leather nursing bag from the hallway, and walked out the front door, the click of her sturdy work boots on the porch, the only answer to their clinical cruelty. The Pittsburgh air was biting and damp, smelling of river water and oncoming rain, but to Alma, it felt like the first clean breath she had taken in 52 years. She didn't head back to the apartment she no longer owned. Instead, she drove her old sedan to a cheap motel on the edge of the city, a place where the neon sign hummed with a low electric anxiety. She sat on the edge of the thin mattress, the smell of stale smoke and industrial cleaner filling her lungs, and pulled out her cell phone to see the string of messages already flooding her screen. Candace had left a voicemail saying she hoped Alma was being an adult about this, while Paul had sent a text asking again about the gold watch, his greed apparently immune to the gravity of the situation. Alma deleted them all, her thumb moving with the same cold efficiency she used to triage a mass casualty event. She wasn't a mother or a liability in that moment. She was a woman who had seen the worst trauma humanly possible and lived, and she was already calculating her next move with the precision of a strategist. The next morning, as the sun struggled to break through the gray Pittsburgh fog, Alma stood in the dusty lobby of the Marshall County Courthouse, her silver bun tight and her denim shirt crisp. She listened to the auctioneer drone on about tax liens and abandoned properties, his voice echoing in the cold, limestone hallway as he described a ruin that the county considered a demolition cost and a public hazard. When he called out the old Liberty Schoolhouse, a place the locals called the Ruin, Alma felt a strange electric sense of recognition that vibrated in her very bones. It was broken, it was forgotten, and it was being treated as a liability by a world that only valued what was shiny and new, just like she was. She raised her hand and offered exactly $5, the smallest bid possible, and when the gavel fell, the sound felt like a birth cry rather than an end. She walked out into the light with a deed in her hand and a fire in her chest, realizing that she didn't need her children or her old home to be whole. She only needed a place that was as resilient as she was. At this moment, as Alma stands on the threshold of losing everything she ever built to reclaim her own soul, I have to ask you something deeply personal. Do you think her children really believe they are doing what is best for her, or are they just trying to hide their own greed under a layer of clinical efficiency? If you were standing in that room, watching this 72-year-old nurse being stripped of her dignity by the people she raised, would you have the courage to speak up, or would you remain as silent as the mahogany table? Tell me what you think in the comments, using just one word to describe your reaction to Alma's children, because your perspective helps us understand the depth of the betrayal we are witnessing together. This is the hardest part of Alma's journey, and your support means the world as we prepare to see how she turns this demolition into a foundation for something legendary. Now, take a deep breath with me, because what happens next is the moment Alma's true nature finally catches the world off guard, and the ruin starts to reveal its secrets. The 90-minute drive from the sterile vertical coldness of Pittsburgh to the rolling jagged hills of Marshall County felt like a descent into a forgotten century. Alma sat behind the wheel of her old sedan, her hands gripped at 10 and 2, watching the landscape bleed from suburban sprawl into the skeletal remains of the Appalachian coal belt. The asphalt eventually surrendered to gravel, and then to a rutted dirt track that groaned beneath her tires as she wound deeper into the Liberty District. The air began to change, losing the scent of diesel and high-finance desperation, replaced by the heavy, iron-rich smell of damp earth and the sharp, piney tang of wild hemlock. She passed rusted skeletons of mining equipment and houses that had folded in on themselves like tired old men, yet with every mile she put between herself and Candace's dining room, the suffocating weight in her chest began to shift. She wasn't fleeing toward a home she was navigating, toward a memory of a place Vernon had once whispered about, a ruin that the county had appraised as a zero, but that her own internal triage told her was the only place left where a heart might still beat. When the old Liberty Schoolhouse finally appeared through the tangle of overgrown sumac and choking ivy, it didn't look like a sanctuary. It looked like a corpse. Built in 1910 for the children of men who never saw the sun, the one-room brick structure stood as a lonely monument to a population that had vanished when the mines went dark in '81. Half the slate roof had surrendered to the weight of 4 decades of snow, leaving a gaping wound that exposed the rotting oak rafters to the elements like bleached ribs. The west wall was a vertical garden of thick, prehistoric-looking ivy that seemed to be the only thing preventing the entire structure from collapsing into the limestone foundation. Inside, the air was 10 degrees colder than the forest floor, smelling of ancient dust-wet lime and the metallic residue of coal soot that had seeped into the very pores of the masonry. Shattered glass from the high-arched windows crunched beneath her work boots, a sound that echoed in the absolute ringing silence of the valley. There was no electricity, no running water, and no evidence that a human soul had crossed this threshold in 40 years yet, As Alma touched the rough frozen surface of a red brick, she felt a faint, rhythmic hum that only a nurse tuned to the low-frequency vibrations of life could recognize. Alma moved through the shadows of the schoolhouse with the cautious, efficient gait of someone entering a trauma room where the power has failed. She cleared a small square of the floor near the original fieldstone hearth, sweeping away decades of dry leaves and rodent droppings with a piece of cardboard she found in the corner. Her vintage leather nursing bag sat on the floorboards, its worn handles a comforting reminder of the 31 years she had spent managing chaos. But in this hollowed-out shell, it looked like a relic from a different world. She unfolded her sub-zero sleeping bag, the nylon rustling loudly in the stagnant air, and realized that her entire worldly existence had been compressed into a space no larger than a hospital cot. The $4,000 in the flower jar was tucked into her bag, a meager ransom for her remaining years, and as the grey light began to fail, the reality of her $5 purchase started to settle into her bones like a chill. She was 72 years old, her joints were throbbing from the drive, and she was currently a squatter in a ruin that the local government considered a public hazard. She sat in the deepening gloom, her silver hair catching the last of the filtered light, wondering if she had finally made the one mistake she couldn't fix with a suture or a bandage. We have reached a moment in Alma's journey where the silence is so heavy it feels like it might crush her, and I want to pause here to ask you something. When you look at your own life, do you see a foundation that is still solid beneath the cracks, or do you feel like the ivy is the only thing holding you together? Alma is at her absolute lowest point, stripped of her family and her home, standing in a place that the world has discarded as trash. If you have ever had to start over from nothing, when everyone said you were too old or too broken to try, please leave a comment with the word resilient to show Alma that she isn't alone in this valley tonight. Your engagement helps us bring these stories of hidden strength to more people who need to know that their value isn't determined by a brochure or a bank manager. Take a moment to reflect on your own schoolhouse, that place within you that still stands despite the storms, and then stay with us as the sun goes down and the real test of Alma's spirit begins. The first night in Liberty Valley was not a romantic beginning, but a grueling descent into the darkest corners of Alma's own mortality. As the temperature plummeted and the coyotes began their jagged, lonely chorus in the hills, she lay in her sleeping bag on the hard floor, staring up through the hole in the roof at a cold, indifferent moon. Every ache in her 72-year-old body seemed to find a voice shouting reminders of the age she had tried to ignore, and the fragility her children had used as a weapon against her. She thought of Candace's warm designer guest room and the clinical safety of the county home, and for the first time the fear of dying alone in this brick cage became a physical weight on her chest. Tears that she hadn't allowed herself to shed at the dining table finally came hot and silent, soaking into the nylon of the sleeping bag as she mourned the 52 years of service that had led her to a dirt floor. She questioned if her stoicism was actually just a form of madness, wondering if Paul was right to call this a breakdown, and if Drew was right to see her as a legacy system that had finally crashed. The silence of the valley wasn't peaceful. It was a vast, empty auditorium waiting for her to admit that she was truly finally obsolete. Change didn't come with a fanfare, but with a single horizontal needle of sunlight that pierced the east window at exactly 6:30 in the morning. It struck the red bricks of the hearth, turning the soot-stained limestone into a glowing golden altar and catching the dust motes in a dance of light that made the air seem alive. Alma sat up, her breath visible in the freezing air, and watched as the light revealed a detail she had missed in the gloom of the previous evening. Behind the schoolhouse, through the shattered frame of the back door, the sun hit the old stone cistern, and she saw the rhythmic silver drip of clear rainwater catching in the basin. It was a pulse, a steady and ancient heartbeat of a building that had been providing for people long before she was born, and was still trying to do so now. The fear that had paralyzed her during the night didn't vanish, but it shifted, moving from her chest down into her hands, transforming from a heavy weight into a sharp, familiar energy. She realized that the schoolhouse wasn't a corpse. It was a patient in deep shock, and she was the only one in the valley who knew the protocol for resuscitation. Alma stood up, her joints popping like dry wood, and reached for her vintage nursing bag, not for medicine, but for the pair of heavy-duty work gloves she had tucked into the side pocket. She didn't start with a grand plan. She started with the triage of the immediate beginning to clear the shattered glass from the floorboards with the same focused intensity she used to clear a surgical field. She moved with a rhythmic precision, her silver bun tight and her denim shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing the lean muscles of a woman who had spent half a century on her feet. With every piece of debris she hauled out to the yard, she felt a layer of Candace's condescension peeling away, replaced by the satisfying friction of labor and the cold, honest weight of the bricks. She found a rusted bucket near the cistern and began to scrub the hearth with rainwater and a handful of dry leaves, the physical act of cleaning becoming a ritual of reclamation. She wasn't just fixing a building, she was scrubbing the scent of betrayal from her own skin, proving with every motion that 72 was not an expiration date, but a rank she had earned through fire. By noon, the sound of Alma's labor had drawn the attention of the only other soul for miles, a tall, weathered man in a faded canvas coat who appeared at the edge of the clearing like a ghost from the valley's past. Elias Thorne stood near a stand of skeletal oaks, his eyes the color of flint, moving from the pile of rotted floorboards in the yard to the woman standing in the doorway of the ruin. He was 75, his face a map of Appalachian winters, and a grief that looked remarkably similar to Alma's own. Yet he didn't move toward her with the pity she had come to expect from the city. He watched her for a long minute, noticing the way she held her shoulders and the surgical neatness of the cleared space behind her, before finally speaking in a voice that sounded like stones grinding together in a creek bed. He asked her if she was looking to fix the place or burn it, noting that the wind had been trying to do both for 40 years without much success. Alma didn't flinch or retreat. She simply looked him in the eye and told him she was a nurse, and that she didn't believe in letting things die if there was still a pulse in the foundation. Elias didn't smile, but he nodded slowly, a gesture of recognition that carried more weight than any of the professional accolades Alma had received in Pittsburgh. He told her that the folks in the valley didn't have much use for hospitals or city doctors, who only looked at them through a billing screen, but they had a desperate need for someone who knew how to stay when everyone else had already left. He mentioned that there were secrets in the masonry of the schoolhouse, things the last teacher had left behind, for a woman who wasn't afraid of the dark or the dirt. As he turned to walk back toward his truck, he pointed to a hollowed-out cavity in the fieldstone hearth that Alma had been scrubbing, suggesting that if she wanted to know what the building was really worth, she should look where the heat used to be. Alma turned back to the hearth, her heart hammering against her ribs, as she noticed a loose stone that didn't quite sit flush with the others, a shadow within the shadow that her scrub brush hadn't yet reached. She reached out her fingers, trembling with a sudden electric anticipation, and as her nails caught the edge of a rusted iron handle hidden deep within the stone, she realized the ruin was about to offer her much more than just a roof. The rhythmic scratch of the steel brush against the soot-stained limestone of the hearth was the only sound in the hollow silence of the Liberty Valley schoolhouse. Alma Jessup worked with the same surgical focus she had once used to debride a wound in a chaotic trauma bay, her 72-year-old muscles burning with a familiar and grounding ache. She was not merely cleaning a ruin, she was performing a deep clinical debridement of the building's history, stripping away 40 years of neglect with every focused stroke. The grey morning light filtered through the shattered arched windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced like tiny ghosts in the freezing air, while the smell of wet lime and iron-rich earth filled her lungs. She had spent the last hour scrubbing the central cavity of the massive fieldstone fireplace, determined to remove the thick, greasy layer of coal soot that had accumulated since the mines went dark in '81. As the bristles hit a specific patch of masonry near the back of the flue, the sound changed from a dull scrape to a hollow metallic ring that vibrated through the wooden handle and straight into the marrow of Alma's capable hands. Her internal triage system immediately flagged the anomaly, because in a building of solid stone and oak, a hollow metallic echo was a sign of a hidden variable. Alma set the brush aside, her silver bun tight, and her denim shirt damp with effort, as she reached into the darkness of the hearth, her fingers searching for the source of the sound. She felt the rough, cold texture of a stone that didn't quite sit flush with its neighbors, a slab of limestone that felt strangely loose against the mortar. With the methodical patience of a woman who had spent 5 decades navigating the complexities of the human body, she began to wiggle the stone, her breath hitching in the cold air as the heavy slab finally groaned and slid forward. Behind it, in a lightless pocket that had been sealed for 45 years, sat a rectangular object that shimmered with a dull orange patina of ancient rust. It was a heavy iron lockbox, nearly 15 pounds of concentrated secrets, and as Alma reached out to touch the freezing metal, she felt a sudden electric surge of recognition that made her heart hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. The box was pitted with age and smelled of old iron-dried lavender and the faint metallic tang of a past that had been intentionally buried. Alma carried the heavy weight to the center of the room, where the sun hit the rotting floorboards, her hands trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and a primal anticipation she hadn't felt since her first day on the hospital floor. The lock was a formidable piece of rusted machinery, but she had her vintage leather nursing bag and the heavy-duty tools Elias had left in the yard. She used a small crowbar with the same calculated leverage she would use to stabilize a fracture, the metal letting out a sharp, protesting screech that echoed through the rafters like a birth cry. When the lid finally gave way, it didn't just open, it surrendered, revealing a treasure trove of documents and personal relics that had been waiting in the dark for a woman who wasn't afraid of the dirt. The scent of 1981 billowed out a mixture of old paper and hope that filled the schoolhouse and made the silver hair on Alma's arms stand up in a chilling wave of realization. Sitting at the very top of the stack was a heavy vellum document sealed with a faded wax stamp and bearing the official insignia of the Marshall County Clerk from the year 1910. Alma unfolded the crisp yellowed paper, her eyes scanning the elegant cursive, as she realized she was holding the original deed to the old Liberty schoolhouse. But this was no ordinary transfer of property, because attached to the deed was a rare Preservation Endowment land use permit that designated the school as a permanent public health sanctuary. The language was precise and unyielding, stating that as long as the building was used for the health and education of the district, it was entirely exempt from property taxes, and most importantly, it could never be seized for private debt. This property was a sovereign medical zone, a piece of earth that existed outside the reach of greedy banks or clinical managers. Alma realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that Candace and her legal maneuvers had no power here because the land itself was a fortress of immunity that had been waiting for its next commander for nearly half a century. Beneath the deed lay another document that made Alma's breath stop entirely, a laminated original community dispensary license issued in 1950. In the rural corners of West Virginia, these grandfathered licenses were worth a fortune to someone with the right credentials because they allowed the holder to operate a full-scale medical clinic without the modern $200,000 corporate bonding requirements. It was a legal loophole, large enough to drive an ambulance through a gift from a forgotten era that effectively bypassed the entire bureaucracy that had tried to decommission Alma's career. She held the license to the light, her thumb tracing the embossed seal, and realized that she was no longer an unemployed retiree or a liability. With this document, and her 31 years of experience as a head ER nurse, she was the most powerful medical authority in the valley, legally authorized to treat patients and dispense medicine on her own terms. The children had tried to lock her in a cage, but the schoolhouse had just handed her the keys to a kingdom they couldn't even imagine. The revelation moved from the practical to the profoundly emotional, as Alma reached deeper into the box and found a thick bundle of letters tied with a piece of blue velvet ribbon. A small note was tucked into the ribbon, written in a steady, elegant hand that belonged to the last teacher of the Liberty District, Martha Gable. The note was addressed simply to the one who finds this, and as Alma read the words, her eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with sorrow. Martha wrote that the walls of the schoolhouse were just skin, but the service within them was the heart. And she had hidden these secrets to ensure that when the valley needed a healer again, the healer would have the tools to stand her ground. She spoke of the building as a living entity that chose its own inhabitants, and she promised that if the finder chose to heal the people, the building would in turn heal the finder. Alma felt a heavy weight of belonging settle over her, a sense that her 52 years of sacrifice were not an erosion, but a long and necessary training for this specific moment in this specific ruin. Among the letters was a collection of testimonies from former students and patients who had been treated in the schoolhouse during the long years before the local mine closed. One envelope was heavier than the others, and when Alma opened it, she found a series of hand-drawn cards and a short letter from 1958, written in a jagged youthful script. It was from a young Elias Thorne thanking Miss Gable for saving his sister's life during a winter fever, when the mountain roads were blocked and the city doctors wouldn't come. He spoke of the schoolhouse as a beacon of light in a dark valley, and he promised that he would always watch over the building in the hope that the light would one day return. Alma looked out the window toward the edge of the clearing, where Elias was currently unloading a stack of seasoned firewood, his weathered face a map of the very history she was holding in her hands. The connection was total and absolute, a circle of care that had been broken for decades and was now being sutured back together by Alma's own silver needles. The depth of the discovery reached its peak as Alma found a small velvet pouch at the very bottom of the iron box, containing a set of high-quality surgical instruments that looked as if they had never been used. There were scalpels, forceps, and a delicate set of silver suturing needles that shimmered in the sunlight like precision jewels. They were a gift from the community to the teacher, a testament to the fact that in this valley, a woman with a healer hands was more valuable than a mountain of gold. Alma picked up a silver needle, feeling its perfect balance and its cold, purposeful weight, and she realized that she had been given a complete and unassailable mandate. She had the deed, she had the license, she had the tools, and she had the legacy of every soul that had ever found sanctuary within these red brick walls. The humiliation of the dining room in Pittsburgh felt like a distant and insignificant noise, a static interference that had finally been cleared from the line by the high-frequency truth of her new reality. Alma sat on the floorboards for a long time, her back against the warm limestone of the hearth, as the full magnitude of her new power settled into her bones. She was no longer a mother who had been discarded, or a nurse who had been told she was obsolete. She was the sovereign of Liberty Valley. She thought of Candace, Paul, and Drew, and realized that they were the ones who were truly fragile because their power was built on paper and social climbing, while hers was now rooted in stone and service. The $34,000 Paul owed her was a drop in the bucket compared to the value of the dispensary license and the tax-exempt sanctuary status of the land. She felt a cold and surgical clarity wash over her, the same focus that had allowed her to lead a trauma team through a mass casualty event. She wasn't going to hide in this ruin, she was going to turn it into a beacon that would draw the entire county back to its senses, while leaving those who betrayed her in the cold shadow of their own arrogance. Elias walked through the doorway a few minutes later, his heavy boots crunching on the cleared floorboards as he stopped beside the open iron box. He didn't ask what she had found, because he already knew the secrets of the hearth, but he watched her with a quiet and profound respect as she showed him the deed and the 1950 license. He told her that he had been waiting 40 years for a woman with the strength to open that box, and that the people of the valley were already starting to whisper about the light in the schoolhouse windows. He offered to help her clear the west wall and repair the roof, mentioning that he knew where to find the original slate, and the seasoned oak needed to make the building whole again. Alma looked at him, and for the first time in 52 years she didn't see a man she had to serve, or a child she had to save. She saw a partner in a labor that was larger than both of them. Together, they began to plan the reconstruction not just of a building, but of a community that had been waiting for its heart to start beating again. By late afternoon, the schoolhouse was transformed from a site of exile into a staging ground for a medical revolution. Alma used her remaining $4,000 to order the first crates of medical supplies and the lime needed to seal the masonry, her mind already mapping out the exam areas and the recovery zones. She worked with a tireless energy, her silver hair glowing in the sunset, as she hauled debris and measured the spaces for the new shelving Elias would build. Every motion was a prayer of reclamation. Every brick she cleaned was a vote of confidence in her own survival and the future of the valley. She was 72 years old. She was a nurse, and she was currently building a sanctuary that would outlive everyone who had ever tried to tell her she was finished. The ruin was healing, and as the first fire of the season began to crackle in the reclaimed hearth, the schoolhouse seemed to exhale a long-held breath of relief, ready to serve the woman who had finally come home. As the first stars began to pierce the purple sky of Marshall County, Alma stood on the porch of the schoolhouse, her vintage nursing bag in her hand and a deed to a kingdom in her pocket. She looked out over the dark, silent valley and realized that the emergency her children had triggered was the greatest gift they could have ever given her. They had tried to strip her of her dignity, only to accidentally provide her with the absolute freedom to be exactly who she was meant to be. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of healing the people of Liberty, and in doing so, she would ensure that the name Alma Jessup would never again be spoken with anything but the deepest reverence. She was the head nurse of the mountains, the sovereign of the schoolhouse, and the woman who had turned a $5 ruin into a miracle of hope. Stay with us as we move into the next chapter, because the world is about to see what happens when the people who were told they were obsolete decide to take their power back and rebuild a legacy that can never be broken. 6 months after Alma Jessup first slept on a cold dirt floor, the old Liberty Schoolhouse stood in the autumn light as a testament to the fact that nothing is ever truly beyond repair if the right hands are doing the work. The gaping wound in the slate roof had been sutured shut with reclaimed stone and seasoned oak, while the west wall was no longer held together by choking ivy but by fresh, expert mortar that shimmered white against the red bricks. Inside, the sterile smell of antiseptic and lavender had replaced the scent of damp earth and rot, creating a sanctuary that felt more like a modern trauma unit than a rural ruin. Alma stood in the center of the newly polished floorboards, her silver hair still in its practical bun, but glowing with a health that had been absent for decades, her muscular arms tanned from months of labor and her posture as straight as a surgical probe. She was wearing a set of crisp navy blue scrubs, the embroidered emblem of the Gable Jessup Clinic over her heart, looking 10 years younger than the woman who had been discarded at a Pittsburgh dining table. The transformation was not just physical, it was a total reclamation of authority that had reverberated across the entire county and landed Alma's face on the front page of the local gazette. The $5 ruin had become the official first responder station for the district, backed by a $52,000 annual county contract that acknowledged Alma as the supreme medical authority of the valley. Every morning, neighbors like old Mrs. Higgins would stop by not just with eggs or garden greens, but with a deep, reverent respect for the woman who had brought a heartbeat back to a dead town. Sheriff Miller had become a regular fixture, drinking coffee by the wood-burning stove and consulting Alma on community safety with a deference he never showed to the state bureaucrats. She was no longer a liability or a legacy system. She was an institution, a sovereign healer whose reputation for saving lives by lamplight had made her the most respected figure in Marshall County. The children who had called her fragile would not have recognized the woman who now managed a complex medical triage with the same effortless precision she used to command a major hospital ward. The arrival of the black European SUV at the edge of the clearing felt like an invasion from a forgotten and much smaller world. The tires crunching on the gravel that Elias had spread just the week before. Candace stepped out first, her designer heels sinking into the soft Appalachian soil, followed by Drew, who adjusted his silk tie as if preparing for a corporate takeover, and Paul, who looked around with a mixture of confusion and suppressed greed. They had seen the newspaper article and heard rumors of the county contract, and they had come to reclaim what they suddenly perceived as a valuable family asset. As they walked toward the open door of the clinic, they were clearly prepared to find a mother in the midst of a mental breakdown, ready to offer a condescending hand to lead her back to the cage they had prepared. But when they crossed the threshold and saw the pristine high-tech sanctuary and the woman standing with her hands on her hips in total command of the space, the clinical scripts they had rehearsed died in their throats. They saw a power they could not buy and a dignity they could not auction, and for a moment, the silence in the schoolhouse was so heavy it felt like a physical pressure against their designer clothes. Candace was the first to recover her voice, her tone a brittle imitation of the concerned daughter routine she had used at the Easter dinner, telling Alma they had been absolutely terrified for her safety. She claimed they had only come because they realized they had been too hasty and wanted to offer her a chance to return to Pittsburgh now that she had gotten this little project out of her system. She spoke about the dangers of the valley and the isolation of the mountains, her eyes darting around the room to appraise the new equipment and the value of the reclaimed property. But Alma did not move, her expression as unreadable as a patient monitor during a critical surgery. Her silence a sharp instrument that forced Candace to keep talking until her justifications became a frantic, disjointed noise. Alma waited until the last echoes of her daughter's lies had faded into the rafters, before speaking with a voice that was low, steady, and absolutely cold. She told Candace that they had not come because they were worried. They had come because they saw a newspaper article and smelled a $52,000 check, and the look of immediate, panicked guilt on Candace's face was the first payment on a 50-year debt. Paul stepped forward then, his eyes avoiding his mother's direct gaze as he tried to pivot the conversation back to his own perpetual needs, mentioning that things had been difficult in the city without her support. He did not ask about her health or the building. He simply began to describe a new consultancy venture that just needed a small infusion of capital to get off the ground, assuming the Bank of Alma was open for one final withdrawal. He spoke with the same parasitic whine that had once drained $34,000 of her life savings, expecting the same maternal shield that had protected his laziness for 4 decades. But Alma reached into the pocket of her scrubs and pulled out a single piece of paper, handing it to him with a movement that was both clinical and final. It was a formal receipt for the $34,000 he owed her, but across the center she had stamped the words "cancelled, family ties severed" in bright, indelible red ink. She told him that the debt was gone and with it his last excuse to ever speak to her again. Her words a surgical cut that removed the parasite from the host once and for all. Drew tried to intervene with the smug, detached authority of a corporate lawyer, stepping between Alma and her children to discuss the legal standing of the property and the children's rights as heirs to the Jessup legacy. He spoke of Alma's age as a factor in her decision-making and hinted that a court might see her purchase of the ruin as an act of incompetence that required the family to take control of the assets for her own protection. He was trying to out-lawyer her in her own home, using the same condescending vocabulary that had once made her feel like a depreciated machine. But he did not realize that Alma had been trained by a dead schoolteacher. She walked over to the desk and laid out the Preservation Endowment Land Use Permit and the 1910 deed, her finger tapping the clause that designated the land as a permanent public health sanctuary. She explained with a terrifyingly calm precision that the land was sovereign, exempt from property tax, and legally immune to any seizure for private debt or family claims. She had outmaneuvered a high-priced attorney using a 100-year-old document and a $5 investment, and as Drew stared at the ancient vellum, his face turned the color of cold ash. The final confrontation ended not with a scream, but with the quiet, devastating sound of a woman who had finally stopped serving people who did not deserve her care. Alma told them that she was no longer a liability, a burden, or a legacy system. She was an institution, and they were no longer welcome in her district or her life. She directed them to the door with a single, authoritative gesture that she had once used to clear a crowded waiting room, and for the first time in their lives, her children had no choice but to obey. They walked out to their expensive SUV in a daze of fury and impotence, the sound of their heels on the gravel sounding like a retreat from a battle they never understood they were fighting. As the vehicle disappeared down the rutted dirt track, the silence of Liberty Valley returned. But it was no longer the heavy silence of a graveyard. It was the vibrant, expectant silence of a sanctuary. Alma watched the dust settle, her silver bun still tight and her hands still steady, realizing that she had finally cleared the infection of their greed from the foundation of her new life. The poetic justice for Candace was swift and ironically clinical, a consequence of the very public neglect she had practiced while trying to maintain her status as a high-powered bank manager. Because she had so loudly declared her mother a liability and an incompetent, the Bank Community Outreach Board conducted an internal audit of her personal conduct and professional ethics regarding elder care. They found that her aggressive attempts to seize Alma assets were a violation of the bank core values, and she was quietly but decisively demoted to a back-office administrative role with zero public contact or authority. She was forced to spend her days managing spreadsheets in a windowless room, becoming exactly the invisible and ignored figure she had tried to force her mother to become. She lost the social standing she had sacrificed her soul to build, trapped in a bureaucratic purgatory where her name was never spoken and her influence was non-existent. The woman who wanted to control the narrative of her mother life found herself erased from her own professional story, a ghost in the very bank she once hoped to lead. Paul's punishment was more mechanical and grounded in the very labor he had spent his entire life avoiding, as the cancellation of his debt stripped him of his only shield against the reality of his own failures. Without Alma's constant infusions of cash to bail him out of his imaginary ventures, his credit score collapsed, and he was eventually forced to take a manual labor job in a local warehouse to keep a roof over his head. Every day, the man who had looked down on his mother's weathered hands was required to use his own to haul heavy crates for minimum wage, his back aching with the same dull pain Alma had carried for 50 years. For Drew, the justice was a sharp financial blow to his professional ego, as his prestigious law firm lost the county multi-million-dollar business due to a conflict of interest clause in Alma's new contract. She had specifically forbidden the clinic or the county emergency services from working with any firm that had a history of ethical complaints regarding elder care, effectively blacklisting him from the very circles he had tried to impress. They had sought to consolidate their power by discarding a 72-year-old nurse, and instead they had engineered their own professional and social suicide. As the sun began to dip below the jagged limestone hills, casting long amber shadows across the clinic floor, Alma Jessup finally allowed herself to sit in the quiet of the reclaimed schoolhouse. She sat by the wood-burning stove, the same one Elias had helped her install, and listened to the steady, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock that matched the healthy pulse of the building. For the first time in 50 years, she was not listening for a husband gambling debts, a daughter demands, or a son parasitic pleas. She was listening to the sound of her own peace. The icy clarity of the ER floor finally began to melt, replaced by a warm, heavy sense of accomplishment that made her silver hair feel like a crown rather than a burden. She leaned her head back against the red bricks of the hearth and let out a long, shuddering breath. And as the first silent tears of pure, unadulterated relief began to track down her weathered cheeks, she realized she was finally home. She was not a mother, a wife, or a servant in that moment. She was just Alma, a woman who had saved everyone else and finally, decisively, saved herself. 2 years have passed since the dust of the black SUV settled on the gravel of the Liberty District, and today the old Liberty schoolhouse does not just stand, it breathes. At 74, Alma Jessup begins her mornings not with the frantic anxiety of a woman serving a gambling husband or ungrateful children, but with the serene precision of a commander. She wakes at 5, the mountain air tasting of frost and hemlock, and sips a single cup of black coffee, while the wood-burning stove crackles in the reception area. By 8, the first of her 10 daily patients arrives, perhaps a minor with a persistent cough, or a young mother whose child has a midnight fever, knowing that in this red brick sanctuary they will find a healer who truly sees them. The Gable Jessup Clinic has become the steady heartbeat of the valley, a place where the sterile scent of antiseptic mixes with the warm, earthy smell of seasoned oak. Alma moves through the exam rooms with a fluid strength, her silver bun a crown of experience, proving every single hour that a woman who was once appraised as a liability is now the most indispensable treasure in the entire county. The greatest joy of this new chapter arrived not in a legal document or a county check, but in the form of a 19-year-old boy with his mother's eyes and his grandmother's stubborn heart. Her grandson Leo fled the sterile, suffocating ambition of Candace's house a year ago, showing up on the schoolhouse porch with nothing but a backpack and a desperate need to find a life that meant something. He now lives in a small, sturdy cabin that Elias Thorne helped him build, by the creek, apprenticing under Alma as a paramedic in training for the rural district. They work side by side in the clinic, a bridge of blood and bone, spanning the gap that Candace and Paul tried to burn down with their clinical greed. While Alma maintains a cold, dignified silence toward her children, sending only a birthday card to Paul with no money inside, she has poured her legacy into Leo, ensuring the light of the schoolhouse will burn long after her own hands go still. This is her partial reconciliation, a blossoming of the future that completely bypasses the rot of the middle generation, proving that love can be reclaimed even when the original structure has been demolished. On quiet autumn evenings when the last patient has gone, and the valley settles into a comfortable indigo silence, Alma sits on the porch and looks at the $5 deed framed on the wall. She reflects on the terrifying night she slept on a dirt floor, realizing that the demolition of her old life was the only way to reveal the sovereign sanctuary hidden beneath the soot of her sacrifices. She knows now that her children did not just try to discard her. They accidentally liberated a force of nature that had been compressed by 52 years of silence and service. Her final thought before the stars pierce the Appalachian sky is always the same: that a ruin is only a tragedy if you forget that the foundation is made of stone. She has turned an act of cold betrayal into a miracle of hope, proving to herself and the world that the most dangerous emergency is the one where you stop believing in your own power. A nurse never truly retires, she thinks with a small knowing smile. She just waits for the right emergency to show the world and herself exactly who she was always meant to be. Thank you for walking this long, difficult road with Alma Jessup, and witnessing the moment a woman the world called obsolete decided to become legendary. We know that many of you watching this have spent your own lives as the invisible engine of your families, saving everyone else, only to realize that no one was coming to save you when the storms hit. If you have ever looked at the weathered skin of your own hands and wondered if the beauty you built was worth the sacrifice, or if you have felt the cold weight of being treated like a piece of old furniture by those you raised, then Alma's victory is your victory too. We would love to hear which part of her journey touched your heart the most, or reminded you of your own hidden strength in the face of betrayal. Please leave a comment below with just one word that describes what you are feeling right now, perhaps resilient or sovereign or free, because your voice is the mortar that holds this community together. Seeing that single word helps us know that Alma's fire is burning in your heart too, and it reminds every woman watching that she is never as alone as the shadows make her feel. As we close this chapter on the $5 miracle of Liberty Valley, let us carry the hard-won lessons of Alma Jessup back into our own lives as shields against those who would try to diminish our light. First, remember that your value is never determined by the people who want to discard you. It is defined by the lives you choose to rebuild and the dignity you refuse to surrender. Second, resilience is not just surviving a storm. It is the calculated act of using the debris of your past to construct a fortress for your future. Third, a sacrifice without boundaries is not love. It is an invitation to be made invisible, and it is never too late to set the terms of your own sovereignty. Fourth, the people who underestimate your age or your history are only revealing the limits of their own vision, never the limits of your capacity to lead a revolution of the heart. These are the truths that kept the schoolhouse standing when the mines went dark, and they are the truths that will keep you whole when the people you trusted most decide to turn their backs. If Alma's story moved you today, please consider sharing this video with a friend or a sister who needs to be reminded that her silver hair is a crown of power, not a sign of expiration. Every time you share these stories of hidden strength, you are helping us build a sanctuary for the voices that the world has tried to silence for far too long. We are so grateful for your presence in this valley and for the way you have supported this 72-year-old nurse through her darkest nights and her brightest victories. Do not forget that your own ruin might just be the staging ground for the most important work of your life, provided you have the courage to pick up the tools and start the triage. We will be back soon with more stories of the incredible people who turned their points of demolition into foundations for a legacy that can never be broken by greed or time. Until then, keep your bun tight, your heart steady, and your hands ready for the work that only you can do. A nurse never truly retires. She just waits for the right emergency to show the world who she really is.